All right, so I'm back with another addition to my, faith series on my channel. And our second faith analysis today will be on Joseph and his brothers. So, for those who aren't familiar with the story of Joseph and his brothers in the Bible, it's a story that perfectly depicts sibling rivalry, but in particular, dealing with siblings who harbor
we're just going to
feelings
go
of
ahead
envy
and hop
towards
right
you.
in. Without further ado, let's jump into this analysis on Joseph and his brothers. So to start, I'm just going to go ahead and provide some biblical context on the story of Joseph and his brothers. For those who may not be familiar from Genesis 37. And it states, Jacob lived in the land of Canaan, where his father Isaac had lived, and this is the story of his family. When Jacob's son Joseph was 17 years old, he took care of the sheep with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. But he was always telling his father all sorts of bad things about his brothers. Jacob loved Joseph more than he did any of his other sons, because Joseph was born when Jacob was very old. Jacob had even given Joseph a fancy coat, which showed that Joseph was his favorite son, and so Joseph's brothers hated him and would not be friendly to him. One day, Joseph told his brothers what he had dreamed, and they hated him even more. Joseph said, "Let me tell you about my dream. We were out in the field tying up bundles of wheat. Suddenly, my bundle stood up, and your bundles gathered and bowed down to it." His brothers asked, "Do you really think you are going to be king and rule over us?" Now they hated Joseph more than ever because of what he has said about his dream. And revisiting that scripture makes me think about this saying that's really common in the faith community. And it goes, favor isn't fair, which is pretty much getting at that sometimes you can't necessarily give a clear reason or rationale behind the favor that is clearly evident in your life. But all that you know and all that other people know is the favor is clearly evident in some way, shape, or form. And what's super interesting about the story of Joseph and his brothers is, or more so the favor that his brothers picked up on, is Joseph wasn't necessarily going to his father to seek out favor. It was a decision that his father had come to on his own. And he gave, a reason behind it. The reason why Joseph was his favorite is because Joseph was a child that he had at an old age. So in his eyes, Joseph was almost like a depiction of a miracle. And obviously, Joseph couldn't help that. All he knew was every time he was mistreated by his brothers, he went to his only ally, which was his father. And what's super interesting about this is I believe that this story also, it clearly depicts this golden child dynamic, but through a different lens. I think a lot of the time, golden children, quote unquote, golden children in a family system get a lot of slack as being, narcissistic, displaying a lot of narcissistic tendencies and traits. But as I continued to, do some research and did some additional deep diving, I realized that golden children aren't always narcissistic. That's not always the case, that they're the one in the family system that, possesses all of these narcissistic tendencies and characteristics. And I actually did another analysis on my channel some time ago on the character Lady May from the hit show Greenleaf, which was on the OWN network. And if they bring that show back, me and my mom will be so happy. Or if they bring it back somewhere, shoot, we will be tuned in. But it's such a good show, and I encourage so many people to go watch it. And ironically enough, it's also a show that's faith-based. So if you, enjoy this faith-based content and you aren't familiar with the show Greenleaf, I strongly encourage you to go and watch the series because it is so good. But Lady May's character in particular, she got a lot of slack, and a lot of people coined her as like this Jezebel-like character. And when we actually learned more about Lady May's character as, episodes started to go on and we started to become more familiar with the characters and their backgrounds, Lady May, trigger warning, excuse me, was actually a survivor of incest. And a lot of the favor that she was, getting when she was a child or throughout her childhood from her father was because she was a victim of incest. He was, abusing her. And her sister had, I believe the sister's character, Maven, I believe that was her name. But Maven had this deep-seated resentment and envy towards her sister, and it was clearly depicted on the show every time Maven's character would pop up.
And even when Lady May's character had arguably one of the worst one of the worst seasons in her life, her sister was still unable to empathize with her because that envy and that jealousy had gotten to the point of no return. And I feel like that this all ties together. So if you haven't watched that analysis, I strongly encourage you to do so, because I stated in that analysis that golden children, or people who have been coined as the golden child in family systems, are often robbed of the opportunity to mourn, to grieve, or even to fail. And I think that this also, it describes this seemingly callous nature that a lot of quote unquote golden children may, present, or even their tendency to strive for perfection a lot, or present themselves as if they are perfect. And I think it's a protective measure that they typically adapt as time goes on, because they know that people aren't necessarily going to extend a helping hand or sympathize or empathize with them, because they feel like everything has already been handed to them. And with that being said, there was another component of that scripture that stood out to me, and it was the scripture, or the particular verse that stated that Joseph was 17 years old. And when I was reading it, it made me think, like, I wonder if this could also be perceived as like symbolism for being naive. And the reason why I say that is, a lot of the time we find ourselves in worse situations after people have already displayed disdain towards us, because we keep going back to them and sharing either good news or bad news when these people have already shown us that they do not care for us. They harbor of jealousy and envy towards us. So we have to be careful, because if we don't take heed to those warnings, we could find ourselves in undesirable situations like Joseph ended up having to endure. And I'm gonna go ahead and read from that scripture that talks about when Joseph's brothers betrayed him out of envy. And the scripture states, when the Midianite merchants came by, Joseph's brothers took him out of the well, and for 20 pieces of silver they sold him to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the well and did not find Joseph there, he tore his clothes in sorrow. Then he went back to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone. What am I going to do?" Joseph's brothers killed a goat and dipped Joseph's fancy coat in his blood. After this, they took the coat to their father and said, "We found this. Look at it carefully and see if it belongs to your son." Jacob knew it was Joseph's coat and said, "It's my son's coat. Joseph has been torn to pieces and eaten by some wild animal." Jacob mourned for Joseph a long time, and to show his sorrow, he tore his clothes and wore sackcloth. All of Jacob's children, came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will go to my grave mourning for my son." So Jacob kept on grieving. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold Joseph in Egypt to a man named Potiphar, who was the king's official in charge of the palace guard. So as we saw in that scripture, as I'm always stating, when it comes to envy, it's typically brewing, and it's a byproduct of sequential stages. But eventually, Joseph's brothers' envy got to the point of no return, and they ended up selling their brother into slavery. Now, the interesting thing about it is this, and I really want to hone in on this point. There are instances where even if you have favor in a particular environment because of one person, what a lot of people will do when they witness that favor and they're uncomfortable, by it, or they're uneasy with it, they will orchestrate, they will come together and join forces to get you out of there. If they can't beat you, right, they'll get rid of you. So what they ended up doing was they conspired a plan to get Joseph out of that environment so that he would no longer reap the benefits of his father's favor. Now, what's funny about it is this: the father still ended up mourning and still did not want the brothers to console him. So it's not like them betraying Joseph, they ended up getting anything from it. However, it does describe how people who harbor feelings of envy towards a particular individual will work together and collaborate to get that person out of the atmosphere. So it's this mentality of, if we can't beat them, we have to get rid of them. And this story of Joseph and his brothers, it actually takes me back to a few excerpts that I've already read on my channel from the book that I'm always referencing on here. But two specific sections came to mind, and it was teamwork makes the dream work tactic, as well as the big reveal, aka sneak attack. I feel like, I've read several times from the big reveal, aka sneak attack section, but I want to read from the teamwork makes the dream work tactic section for this analysis, just to provide some additional context. And the section reads, "The teamwork tactic is much more intense
due to the mutual intention to take the target down. When it's a collaborative effort and all parties involved are dedicated to ruining the target of envy, the attacks become brutally heinous. And there's another section that I believe is relevant to the story of Joseph and his brothers in the book, and it's the section that dissects the chessboard and in particular the chess pieces. And what actually stood out to me when revisiting the story of Joseph and his brothers is the section in the book that talks about pawns. And due to the fact that pawns do not have a higher, value on the board in comparison to other pieces, and they're oftentimes easier to get captured and to pretty much be sacrificed on the board, what they do is they collaborate with others. So they utilize this notion of quantity over quality to move up the rank. And as depicted with the story of Joseph and his brothers, and in particular their, dynamic with their father, clearly the brothers couldn't override the father's decision because it was already set in stone. The father clearly favored Joseph, and there was nothing that the boys could do to change his mind. Even when Joseph was gone, he still was mourning over Joseph being gone and was like, I don't even want to be around you guys. You guys suck. But nevertheless, the pawns in this case, which will be Joseph's brothers, knew that they couldn't override the king's choice, the king's decision. So what they did was they worked together to overpower Joseph and his father and get Joseph out of there. And this is oftentimes significant when people find themselves dealing with a lot of sneak attacks. And that's the reason why I brought up that other section in the book too, even though I feel like teamwork makes the dream work was pretty significant when we think about the story of Joseph and his brothers. The sneak attack component is also prevalent in this case. And a lot of people not only experience this maybe in their family dynamics, but there are some people who may have dealt with this in the workplace where they were let go of, or, they dealt with some kind of smear campaign and lost an opportunity, lost a job because their coworkers and their colleagues conspired against them to get them out of there because they knew that they couldn't necessarily override the decision of someone who was in a prominent position. But instead, what they did was they, collected a bunch of false claims and a bunch of false information to get that person out of there. Because typically when we think about any group setting, any social setting, people go with the majority vote, even if the majority vote is dead wrong. And it's important to take note of these types of dynamics and even think about these types of interactions if you find yourself dealing with them in a way that, was depicted in the book, such as the chessboard, and understanding that even though, or just because someone may not have a prominent position, that doesn't mean that they won't get crafty and clever with their attempts to get rid of the person that they're envious of. But it's important to keep in mind and revisit that particular scripture, the first scripture that I read in this analysis, which talked about how it wasn't until Joseph shared his dream with his brothers that they proceeded to attack him and sell him into slavery. And when we think about it from that context, right, even though the envy was prevalent, the brothers got to the point where it was almost like they had a breakdown. They couldn't take the favor anymore. First you have, favor from our father. Second, you get a coat of many colors by our father, which is the physical representation of, you being the favorite. And then here you come walking over here talking about you had a dream that you're going to reign supreme and, be superior over us in the next few years. And we're going to have to bow down and answer to you. We got to get this kid up out of here. You're not Martin Luther King. You can't just be out here walking around talking about you had a dream. We got to get you out of here. You got to go. So when we put those types of, situations into context, right, it's so important that we don't get caught up in this imaginary comfort zone. And what I mean by that is a lot of us make this mistake of thinking that we are incubated because of our relationship with the person. And when someone has started to display signs of envy, no matter what our relationship with them is, no matter what our association with them is, you cannot take it lightly because you cannot bank on this person taking it easy on you once they've reached this full-blown state of envy. So it doesn't matter if it's, a family member, as Joseph and his brothers. And also, too, sometimes we think that we're safe even in professional settings because we're just like, well, there are certain rules and regulations in place. There are people who will bend rules. There are people who will step outside of certain rules and regulations and, certain parameters because their envy has gotten to the point of no return where they're not even thinking rationally anymore. This is why really dissecting envy outside of this lens of, just boosting someone's ego or, feeling better about ourselves or being braggadocious. It's really about us taking into consideration that envy is not anything to take lightly, and it can very much so become dangerous, right? So when we find ourselves assessing multiple instances where someone has shown us that they are resentful of the favor that we have in our life, whatever that favor may be, however that favor may present itself, you have to understand that you do not have an ally in this person. This person is your enemy. They are your adversary, okay? And they're looking for the opportunity to attack whatever it is that they're envious of at any opportune time. So even though it's important to be cautious of sharing, your downfalls, your weaknesses, your shortcomings with people who are envious of you, you have to be just as cautious and just as mindful of sharing your dreams and your aspirations with envious people, because they will do everything in their power to stop you from reaching your full potential. All right, babes, that's all that I have for this faith analysis on Joseph and his brothers, and in particular depicting sibling rivalry and envy. But of course, I want to hear you all's experiences, your opinions, your perspectives, your comments in the comment section below. I want to thank you all so much for tuning in, and I look forward to speaking to you guys in the next one. Take care, babes.